Do you believe trauma runs in families like a pattern or breaks with you?
You ever buy someone groceries, cover their rent, help them finish school, keep their fridge full, their lights on, and their tank halfway decent in winter, and then find out, through your cousin's girlfriend's sister, no less, that you weren't invited to Christmas dinner this year? Not even forgotten. Not mistakenly left out. But very much not included. Deliberately. And the reason? Because your baby brother, the same one you practically raised while juggling college and a second job, told your mother you'd be too embarrassing to have around his fiancé's family. That was me, sitting in my tiny kitchen with a lukewarm cup of coffee and my email open, reading the chain from Mom, subject line, Christmas details, and realizing my name wasn't anywhere on it. Not even a "what about Julia" from anyone. Nothing. Just cheerful updates about potluck dishes, Sabrina's parents arriving from Charlotte, the Airbnb mom booked for overflow guests, and a note from Nathan saying, "Let's keep this cozy this year, just the younger generation and Sabrina's family." Simpler that way. Simpler. That was the word he chose. Like I was an obstacle. A complication. Some dusty old piece of furniture you shove into the garage before company comes over. The only reason I even saw the email was because Greg, our cousin, forwarded it to me with one sentence. "Hey, did you mean to skip this?" At first, I thought it was a mistake. I even laughed. I called Mom. No answer. I texted Nathan. "Hey, just checking, am I missing something with the Christmas plans?" 2 hours later, he finally replied. And I swear I will never forget reading that message, sitting in the soft blue glow of my kitchen light, just before the coffee turned bitter and cold. He said, "Yeah, look, Jules, it's just a little complicated this year. Sabrina's family is very formal, and you know how you can get with, like, the jokes and stories. We're trying to keep the vibe a little more professional. No hard feelings. Love you." Professional. That word landed like a slap across the face. I scrolled up, reread it twice. Professional. As if our family was some kind of business pitch and I didn't fit the brand. I stared at that message, and all I could think about was the time he called me, for years ago, crying outside a gas station because his car had broken down, and he'd missed rent again, and he didn't know what to do. Back then, I didn't hesitate. I left work early, wired him the money before I even finished my sentence. I've lost count of how many times I bailed him out, when his financial aid didn't clear in time, when he overdrew his account, when he couldn't afford therapy, when Sabrina's boutique job cut her hours and they needed just a little boost for groceries. I gave him all that. Quietly. Willingly. Like family's supposed to. So no, I didn't scream. I didn't call him out or demand he change his mind. I didn't show up at Christmas uninvited like some sitcom punchline, holding a sad fruitcake and fake smile. I didn't do anything dramatic. What I did was open my budgeting spreadsheet. It's color-coded. I've always been that way. I work in finance. Makes sense. I'd never really thought about how much I was giving Nathan month to month, but when I laid it all out, the numbers punched me in the gut. $700 a month for rent, direct debit. $150 for groceries, sometimes more when I sent him those Instacart surprise orders. His phone was still on my family plan, $75. Gas money now and then. A yearly tuition top-up, because apparently community college admin is a mess. Altogether, nearly $15,000 over the last 3 years. Maybe more. And not once, not one single time, did he say he felt embarrassed to take it. But now? When it came to showing me to the polished, church-going, white wine-sipping in-laws from Charlotte, I was suddenly a liability. I clicked on the rent auto payment and canceled it first. That one was easy. I didn't even feel a tremor in my chest. The groceries came next. I paused for a second, hovered over the recurring transfer, and thought about how many late-night texts I'd gotten from him. "Can you spot us just till Friday?" Always us, like it wasn't really him asking, but some invisible we that made it less pathetic. I canceled that too. Then I opened Verizon. Removed his line. There was a small cancellation fee. I paid it gladly. By the end of the night, I'd erased myself from his financial existence. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about pride. It was about clarity. I finally saw where I stood, not as a sister, not even as family, but as a tool. A card he could swipe when it suited him and slide back in the drawer when company came over. And you know what? I didn't cry. I slept like a rock. Woke up the next morning, brewed my coffee, and smiled for the first time in weeks. The silence felt clean. No more late-night calls. No more frantic texts. No more guilt. But that silence wasn't going to last. 3 days later, I got a call from Mom. I didn't pick up. I watched the voicemail transcript roll in. "Hey, sweetie, just checking on you. Nathan's a little worried. Some stuff isn't working at his apartment. Rent didn't go through or something. Just wondering if you know anything about that." I didn't reply. I just stared out the window, into the gray December sky, and waited for the unraveling to begin. Because here's the thing about being the one holding everything up behind the curtain. When you quietly step away, everything starts to collapse in slow motion. And I wanted him to feel every single falling brick. There's a strange kind of silence that settles over you when you've made a decision you can't take back, a silence that doesn't come from guilt or second-guessing, but from an internal shift, a tectonic move beneath the surface of who you are and who you've let yourself become for far too long. In the days following the email, that silence became my constant companion, not heavy like mourning, but still, focused, surgical, like I'd cut a tumor out of myself and was now waiting to see if the bleeding would stop or spread. I didn't talk to Nathan, didn't respond to Mom's voicemails, didn't mention it to Greg when he sent me a half-joking text saying, "Christmas ain't Christmas without you asking for boxed wine at dinner." I just got quiet, stayed in my lane, and watched as the first cracks began to show in the perfect little world Nathan had tried to curate without me in it. It started with the rent. Of course it did. That was always the biggest chunk, the one I knew they couldn't replace quickly, not when Sabrina only worked part-time at a bridal boutique and Nathan was still launching his startup, which, as far as I could tell, was mostly him tweeting from coffee shops and calling it networking. He texted me 3 days after the rent payment would have hit the landlord's portal, starting casual, like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't been deliberately uninvited from a family event I've attended every year since I was old enough to keep my green bean casserole from burning. "Hey, Jules," the message began. "Weird thing, did the rent get delayed this month? Not seeing the transfer come through. System glitch maybe?" I stared at the message for a good minute before setting my phone down without responding. The audacity of it, the lightness of the tone, like he wasn't entirely sure what game I was playing or whether I'd even noticed I'd been erased from the guest list. I suppose part of him genuinely thought I'd be too soft to do anything about it, or maybe he believed I just didn't have the spine to disrupt the carefully spun narrative that made him the charming, struggling underdog and me the overbearing, inconvenient older sister who just doesn't get it. The second blow came with the groceries. For the last year, I'd been quietly covering their Instacart deliveries once a week, nothing extravagant, just basics and a few indulgences, like the oat milk creamer Sabrina liked and the fancy organic frozen meals Nathan pretended he hated, but always finished. I'd set up the payment so it pulled from my account and showed up like a gift from the food gods every Wednesday around 5 p.m., just in time to keep the fridge from looking too empty. The week after the rent cut off, I canceled the recurring payment and watched the silence grow louder. No thank you. No protest. Just absence. Then came the phone bill. That one was almost funny. I'd added Nathan to my plan 2 years earlier, when his credit was trash and he couldn't pass the check to get a decent contract on his own. He never paid me back, not once, and I'd stopped expecting it after the 3rd month. But this time, when I logged in and clicked Remove Line, there was an unexpected sense of satisfaction, a kind of moral cleanliness to it, like I was untangling myself from a machine that had used my loyalty as its fuel source for far too long. The system warned me that disconnecting his line would cost an early termination fee. I clicked Confirm anyway. I considered it a small investment in my sanity. A few hours later, he called from Sabrina's phone. I didn't answer. I watched the screen light up, his name popping up under her number, and felt no tug, no reflex, no guilt. Just a dull curiosity, like watching someone knock on a door they welded shut themselves. That evening, I got a message from Mom. This time it wasn't a voicemail. She'd finally figured out texting. The message read, "Hi honey, not sure what's going on with Nathan. He's saying things aren't working at the apartment, maybe utilities? He's a little overwhelmed with Sabrina's parents in town. Can you check in on him?" Check in on him. The wording was perfect. Innocent. Passive. Like I was some kind of social worker rather than the person who'd kept him afloat for nearly half a decade. I didn't respond. Not yet. Not until I had time to process the absurdity of being asked to babysit the same adult man who'd uninvited me from a family Christmas out of sheer, polished shame. But here's where things started to get interesting. By Friday, I heard from Greg. Not a text this time, a call, voice shaking a little, not from emotion, but from holding in laughter. He said, Nathan's spiraling. You know he's got Sabrina's whole family staying with him, and the hot water went out this morning? Dude tried to blame the building, but turns out the bill hadn't been paid. Guess he assumed you were still covering it. I said nothing for a long moment, and then Greg, with that half-serious, half-joking tone he always uses when something is really, really wrong, added, I don't know what's going on, Jules, but whatever it is, keep doing it. I haven't seen him this flustered since his prom date dumped him during photos. I didn't laugh, but I smiled, small, quiet, to myself. It wasn't joy, not exactly, and it sure as hell wasn't revenge in the way people picture it, with big dramatic speeches or triumphant exits. It was something else. Something colder, steadier, more like justice finally getting its turn at the table. And yet, there was still that part of me, the part that remembered his baby curls, his scraped knees, the time he cried when our dog died, that winced a little, not from guilt, but from recognition. I'd spent years believing that love meant endurance, that being family meant absorbing every slight and sacrifice, every insult wrapped in charm, every manipulation disguised as affection. But now, with every bill he couldn't pay and every comfort that vanished from his life, I realized I'd spent so long protecting him from consequences that he'd forgotten they even existed. Now he was remembering. Slowly. Painfully. And I wasn't finished. Not even close. There's a specific expression people wear when they realize, too late, that the safety net they assumed would always be there is gone, an expression I'd seen once before on Nathan's face when we were kids, and he rode his bike down the hill behind our house without brakes, only to discover the bottom was all gravel and panic. That same expression came back into my life, full-grown and panicked, just over a week after I cut off every financial thread tying us together, when he showed up, unannounced and visibly shaken, at the entrance of my office building. Standing awkwardly under the overhang with his hands in his pockets like a teenager waiting to be called into the principal's office, but trying to act like it was all some normal coincidence, as if he just happened to be in the area. And not because the illusion he had built around himself was starting to crumble under the weight of his own delusion. I saw him through the glass as I walked back from lunch, my coffee cooling in one hand, my coat still dusted with city slush, and I could tell immediately that this wasn't a social visit. His hair was a mess, not in the deliberate, styled way Sabrina always fussed over, but in the frantic, slept on the couch and didn't shower kind of way. His eyes darted toward me as I approached, and for a split second, I thought he might run, but he stood his ground, offered me a lopsided, painfully rehearsed smile, and said my name like it was a test to see how angry I really was. Jules, he said, his voice cracking just enough to betray how much of a mess he was trying to keep under the surface. Hey, can we talk? I didn't answer immediately, not out of spite, but because I genuinely needed a second to decide whether I wanted to take this conversation indoors or let the cold do the talking for me. Eventually, I tilted my head and motioned toward the coffee shop across the street, partly because I didn't want him in my office and partly because the public setting would keep things from escalating or, at the very least, limit how much I'd feel tempted to say what I truly felt. We sat by the window, the sound of steam hissing from the espresso machine filling the gaps between our silence, and I waited for him to start, to dig his own hole, to stumble into the truth he still hadn't quite owned. And when he finally did speak, it was in that same cautious, performative tone he always used when he wanted something, that soft, pleading cadence that had worked on Mom, on Sabrina, and, until recently, on me. "I feel like there's been a misunderstanding," he began, eyes darting around the room like he hoped the barista might swoop in and save him from having to finish the sentence, "with the rent, and the bills, and everything. I didn't realize you were, well, that you were doing all that. I mean, I thought we had an arrangement, but maybe I took it for granted, and if I did, I'm sorry." It was almost impressive how skillfully he crafted that sentence to sound apologetic without actually admitting to anything concrete. I said nothing, let the silence do the work, watched him squirm in it, and eventually, he broke. "I didn't mean what I said to Mom," he added, more hurried this time, "about Christmas, about you being, you know, too much. That wasn't what I meant. Sabrina was just stressed, and I guess I panicked. I didn't want to make a scene in front of her parents." The word "scene" hit me harder than I expected, not because it was new or shocking, but because it was so casually cruel, so emblematic of the way he'd framed me, not just this year, but for years, as the loud one, the awkward one. The overly honest sister who asked too many uncomfortable questions and never quite fit into the curated image of effortless charm he was always trying to sell to whoever was watching. I took a sip of my now lukewarm coffee, set the cup down carefully, and looked him straight in the eye before speaking, slow, deliberate, no anger, just clarity. "You didn't make a mistake, Nathan. You made a decision. You chose to pretend I wasn't part of the family the moment it became inconvenient. You didn't trip into this. You walked into it with both eyes open." He flinched slightly, the kind of involuntary twitch that happens when someone is hit with a truth they can't dodge. I could see it in his posture, the way he slumped slightly, deflated not by guilt, but by the realization that I wasn't going to be soft about this anymore, that the version of me he'd relied on, always understanding, always forgiving, always fixing things behind the scenes, was gone, or at least in hibernation. He tried again, weaker this time, leaning on the old tricks. "I didn't think it'd hurt you this much. I figured you'd get it, you know? That it was just for this year, just to make things easier. Sabrina's family is kind of formal and, I don't know, I guess I was trying to make a good impression." I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him, absorbing the full weight of how small he thought of me, how little he believed I mattered in the grand scheme of his life, except when I was solving problems he didn't want to admit existed. "You've been living in a fantasy, Nathan," I said finally, "one where you're the hero, the struggling genius with the perfect fiancé and the supportive family who just magically keeps everything running. You didn't make a good impression, you made yourself look like a child who can't handle the truth. And now the grown-ups are out of the room." He stared at me, mouth slightly open, probably waiting for the part where I'd soften, offer a way out, slip him a second chance like I always used to. But that part never came. I stood, slid my coat back on, and left him there with his untouched cappuccino and the uncomfortable realization that the ground beneath him wasn't just shaking, it had already split wide open. Later that evening, I did one more thing. I sent a short, painfully direct message to the family group chat that, until that night, I had never once used for anything more dramatic than asking who was bringing pie. It said, "If anyone's wondering why I wasn't at Christmas, ask Nathan. He knows." No punctuation. No explanation. Just that. And then I put my phone on Do Not Disturb, poured myself a glass of wine, and waited for the sound of silence to be replaced by the crashing of carefully built lies finally running out of room. By the time Nathan's name began bouncing between family members like a pinball, echoing through phone calls and texts and quiet little side conversations cloaked in concern, I had already distanced myself so completely from the chaos that it almost felt like watching a fire through glass. Bright, dangerous, destructive, but no longer able to touch me. Not anymore. The message I sent to the family group chat hadn't even been aggressive. It was measured, minimal, too sharp, clean sentences that did all the cutting necessary without any need for dramatics. And yet it landed with the force of a confession dropped in the middle of a crowded church, forcing everyone to look at each other and wonder who had sinned and who had merely watched in silence. The fallout began slowly, predictably, with Mom reaching out first, not with anger, not with any real confrontation, but with that breathless, overly sweet tone she reserved for conflict she didn't want to acknowledge out loud. The same tone she used when telling us as kids that Dad wasn't gone, but taking time to figure things out, as if we were too fragile to hear the truth and too dull to notice it. She called twice, left voicemails I didn't answer, and eventually sent a text that simply read, "Honey, can we talk? I think things are getting a little out of hand." Out of hand. That was her takeaway. Not that I'd been deliberately excluded. Not that I'd been financially used and emotionally sidelined for years. But that the situation had become inconvenient, like spilled coffee on a white tablecloth rather than the exposed rot in the family foundation it truly was. I didn't reply. Not yet. I knew better than to walk into a discussion where the primary goal was to put the fire out rather than ask who struck the match. It was 2 days later when Nathan showed up again, this time not at my office or in a coffee shop, but at my front door, standing under the yellowed porch light like a ghost from a life I'd already started to bury. He didn't knock immediately. I watched him through the window for a good 30 seconds as he stood there, arms folded tightly across his chest, eyes darting toward the street every time a car passed, like even now he couldn't quite decide whether to confront the truth or keep running from it. When I finally opened the door, I said nothing, just stepped aside and let him walk in, because whatever else was left between us, anger, resentment, betrayal, it didn't cancel out the years I spent teaching myself that compassion didn't mean weakness, and that sometimes letting someone speak was more powerful than shutting them out. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating properly, and hadn't yet accepted that the damage wasn't temporary, it was structural, deep, possibly permanent. "I messed up," he said finally, and to his credit, his voice didn't carry the usual shine, the manipulative edge, or the half-charming, half-broken tone he used to get his way. It was flat. Honest. At least I hoped it was. "I didn't know how much I was leaning on you until it stopped. I mean, I knew, but I didn't feel it. Not like this." I sat on the edge of the couch and let the silence stretch between us, let him fill it or leave it, let him stew in the weight of everything I wasn't going to rush to forgive. "You paid for everything," he continued, his words thick with regret, but still somehow lacking the weight of true accountability. "I mean, the rent, the food, the phone. God, even the tuition." Sabrina had no idea. She thought it was all me. She thought I was managing. She found out last week when the Wi-Fi cut out and I couldn't explain it. She left, Julia. She said she doesn't know who I am. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw not the selfish, image-obsessed man-child who had discarded me to impress his in-laws, but the frightened little brother who used to crawl into my bed when the storms got too loud, who used to look up at me with wide eyes and believe that I could fix anything. And that was the hardest part, because he wasn't entirely wrong. I had fixed everything for years, quietly, invisibly, without ever demanding anything in return. "I gave everything to you," I said, the words quiet but steady, more like a fact than an accusation, because I wasn't looking to shame him, I just needed him to hear it. "I gave you stability when you were falling apart. I gave you my savings when you couldn't pay tuition. I gave you my time, my name on the lease, my silence when you acted like the responsible one. And you repaid that by calling me embarrassing behind my back because your fiancé's parents shop at Whole Foods and speak with soft voices." He opened his mouth to defend himself, but I held up my hand, and to his credit, he stopped. "You didn't just exclude me," I continued, "you erased me. You made me disappear so you could look better in front of strangers. And now that everything's falling apart, you're here because you want help, not because you're sorry, not because you understand what you did, but because it's uncomfortable to live without the safety net you took for granted." That time, he didn't try to argue. He just sat down, elbows on his knees, head hanging low like someone who'd finally run out of spin. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, almost a whisper now. I didn't know it would hurt you that much." And there it was again, that insidious little phrase, the one that wrapped cruelty in confusion and painted it as an accident. "I know," I replied, standing up slowly and walking toward the door. "You didn't know. Because I never made you feel it. But now you do. He looked up at me then, and for the first time in years, I think he actually saw me, not the version he told himself existed, not the background character in his curated life story, but the woman who had carried him further than he even realized, and who was finally done pretending it hadn't cost her anything. I'm not cutting you out, I added, one hand on the door, but I'm done carrying you. If you want a relationship, it starts from zero. No money, no guilt. Just honesty. He nodded slowly, but whether it was in agreement or just resignation, I couldn't tell. I opened the door and waited. He stood, walked past me, and stepped into the cold night without another word. And for the first time in years, my house felt warm, quiet, yes, but not empty. Just peaceful. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not even close. Because when you take your hands off a machine that's been running too long, the parts don't just stop, they screech, they grind, they shatter. And Nathan's life was only just starting to fall apart. There's a moment, usually quiet and unceremonious, when the dust finally begins to settle, not because the storm has passed, necessarily, but because everything that could have broken already has. And the only thing left standing is the truth you no longer need to prove, defend, or explain. That moment came 2 weeks after Nathan walked out of my house without a plan, without Sabrina, and without the carefully woven web of assumptions he had relied on for years, assumptions about me, about how far he could push, about what I would endure and excuse and smooth over simply because I had done it so many times before that it had become expected, automatic, almost invisible. But this time had been different, and not because I'd snapped in anger or sought revenge in some explosive, cinematic way, but because I'd stopped, just stopped, and when the person who holds the ceiling up walks away, the entire structure begins to sag, then shift, then crack until eventually it collapses under its own weight. What happened in the days that followed wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was relentless. Phone calls I ignored, texts that came in pairs and triplets, questions wrapped in concern that weren't really concern at all, but curiosity dressed up as compassion. Mom called again, this time more direct, her tone less sugar-coated than before, as if enough people had whispered in her ear to suggest that maybe something truly serious had happened, something that couldn't be brushed away with a tray of leftover pie and a well-timed change of subject. She asked what Nathan had done. She asked what I had done. She asked what could be fixed. And for the first time in my life, I didn't offer her an answer. I told her that if she wanted to understand what broke between us, she'd have to ask the person who did the breaking. She didn't like that. She sighed and said, "You know he's not good at explaining things." I said, "Then maybe he shouldn't be breaking them." Greg, ever the quiet observer of our family circus, finally reached out with more than just jokes or side comments. He said, "I think you scared the hell out of him." I asked why. He said, "Because you didn't yell. You didn't fight. You just disappeared. And that's the one thing he never thought you'd do." That landed. Not because I hadn't known it already, but because hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel more real, like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't overreacting or being too sensitive or punishing someone who simply made a social misstep. And then came the message from Sabrina. It came through Facebook, of all places, like something from the early 2010s, with a subject line and everything, as if she were penning a formal letter from one wounded party to another. She said she hadn't known, not about the rent, or the groceries, or the tuition, or even the phone plan. She said she'd believed Nathan's version of himself, the one he curated for her and her family, the one where he was holding everything together, struggling nobly under pressure, a man on the edge of greatness who just needed a little more time, a little more space, a little more support. She said she left him not because he wasn't successful yet, but because he lied, consistently, about what his success was built on, and worse, about who had been holding the scaffolding. She didn't apologize for what she said about me, not directly, but she ended the message with a sentence that felt heavier than anything else. "He talked about you like you were a burden. I see now that you were the one keeping him afloat." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. It wasn't about me and her. It never had been. What came next was something I didn't expect. Nathan, alone, showing up to Mom's house with a garbage bag of clothes and the same sheepish look I'd seen on him when he was 16 and got caught sneaking beer into the basement. Greg told me he looked pale, thinner, quieter. He wasn't asking for anything, at least not out loud, but everyone could tell that he didn't have anywhere else to go. Mom let him stay, of course she did, because she always does, and maybe that's her role in all this. She can't say no to him, even now, even after everything. I didn't interfere. I didn't offer help. I didn't even visit. But a few days later, I did get in my car, drive the 40 minutes across town, and walk into that house, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I wanted to look him in the eye and make sure he understood that forgiveness wasn't automatic, and real love, comes with boundaries, not blank checks. The living room was quiet when I arrived, a strange hush hanging in the air like everyone was holding their breath. Mom gave me a fragile smile, tried to usher me into the kitchen with the offer of reheated casserole, but I shook my head and asked, "Where is he?" She nodded toward the back room. I walked there slowly, not with dread or anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who has already lived through the storm and knows there's nothing left to fear. He was sitting on the old futon, the one I used to sleep on when I visited during college, and he looked up at me like a kid waiting for a verdict. No smugness. No charm. Just a man whose cards were all finally on the table. "I didn't know how much I needed you," he said, his voice almost too quiet to hear. "And I didn't know how much I hurt you." I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle. "That's the problem, Nathan," I said slowly. "You didn't know. Because you never had to. Because I never made you." He nodded, eyes glassy but dry, like someone too tired to cry anymore. "I don't expect you to fix this," he added. "I just want to know if there's anything left to fix." That was the question, wasn't it? The question that every family eventually circles around, after the betrayal and the silence and the breaking apart, when all the wounds are still raw but everyone's too tired to keep fighting. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the brother I had once protected or the man who had humiliated me, but the sum of both flawed, foolish, and finally, maybe, learning. "I don't hate you," I said, and it was true. "But I don't trust you. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the same way. You'll have to earn that back. Every single inch of it." He nodded again. "I will." I turned to leave, stopped in the doorway, and said without looking back, "Next year, if there's a Christmas invitation, I expect to be on the list." And then, without waiting for a reply, I walked out, because I'd said what I came to say, and whatever happened next wasn't mine to manage. The truth is, I don't know if he'll ever really change. I don't know if the lesson will stick, or if the old patterns will resurface once things get comfortable again. But I do know this. I drew a line, and for the first time in my life, I didn't erase it just because someone else tripped over it. Some people say family is unconditional, but I don't believe that anymore. I believe love has conditions, and the first is respect. And if I'm too embarrassing for that, then I guess I'd rather be alone than invisible.